Hey, this is Mike Robbins. Thanks so much for joining me for this episode of the podcast. I hope you're doing well, you, your team, your family, everyone around you, as we roll through October as I'm recording this. Hey, it's been a couple weeks since I released an episode, as you may or may not have noticed. It wasn't necessarily the plan. Sometimes I take planned breaks, but I actually have had quite a whirlwind of travel the last few weeks. Some local events, but I had an event in Toronto. And then last week, I actually had an event in Dubai, and it was my first time ever traveling to Dubai. And I actually want to talk a little bit about that, not so much the trip as much as just the idea of really thinking differently and shifting our perspective. Over the last couple weeks, as I've been traveling to different parts of the world and speaking at some different events. My event in Toronto a couple weeks ago, there were people from all over Toronto, especially from the Quebec, Montreal area where people mostly speak French. And so I had some really interesting conversations there. And then I went to Dubai and spoke at a leadership conference there that had people from all over the Middle East, and even parts of Africa and Eastern Europe. And it was just fascinating, talking to people from Kazakhstan, talking to people from Pakistan and Iran and Egypt. And just, it was really enlightening. And one of the things that I notice whenever I travel, even if I just go somewhere outside of the state of California or outside of the Bay Area where I live, but especially the further away that I get, I go to the East Coast of the United States or, go to Canada or Mexico or go to Europe or Asia or in this case, my very first time in the Middle East. I'm just aware of some of the biases that I have. And, not in a negative way necessarily, but just I think of myself as someone who's pretty open-minded, tries to be curious and inclusive about how I think and the way that I relate to people. And when I leave home, I grew up here in the Bay Area. I'm confronted by the fact that, like, whoa, my worldview is very specific to where I live, where I grew up. And I think that's true for most of us. And I grew up also as someone who didn't travel a lot. We didn't have a lot of money. We didn't take a lot of trips, in the car or definitely not on an airplane to fly anywhere. The first time I left the country was when I was playing for Team USA when I was 18 years old, and we went to Mexico. And that was an exciting trip, but also, eye-opening. And over the course of my life, and particularly the last number of years, with my business, having the opportunity, the privilege, and the incredible opportunity to travel to lots of different places around the world, I'm super grateful, but it's also such a great opportunity to challenge some of my assumptions, to challenge some of my thinking. And whether it's related to travel or not, I think it's something that's important for all of us, especially these days. I mean, right now, as I'm recording this, we're less than a month away from a presidential election here in the US, which is always an interesting and kind of intense, challenging time. We've gone through so much change, so much disruption, so much upheaval and uncertainty over the last number of years through the pandemic and everything that we've been through. And the world of work, the world that we live in, whether it's with respect to hybrid working, whether it's with respect to artificial intelligence, or just some of the ways that we interact and communicate, so many things are changing, have changed, will be changing. And the pace of that change just seems to be speeding up all the time. We've now got four and in some cases five generations in the workforce. And, things are, I think, really exciting and interesting right now, but they're definitely unstable in certain ways. And in the coming weeks and months, as especially here in the US, as we move through whatever's going to happen politically, I think that some of that instability and some of that uncertainty is going to continue. So our ability to think differently, our ability to change our perspective, our ability to relate with and connect to people who think differently than we do is not only a nice to have, it's a need to have. But it can be challenging, right? For a bunch of reasons. We're used to thinking and operating the way that we think and operate. We're used to being around the people that we're around. We all come from certain places. We have certain ways that we think about life, about work, about communication, about relationships, about leadership, about teamwork, about whatever the case may be. And we tend to get, you know, stuck to some degree, or at least fixed in those ways. And even with all of the great technology that we have and the ability to connect with people all over the world instantaneously these days, the way the algorithm works with social media, as we all know, is we're continually fed information that reaffirms our bias. So, we start searching for things online and then we start getting fed more of that. You start looking at YouTube videos, you get more videos like that. You start, searching for things on Google or on Amazon or on social media, and more of that shows up. You start clicking on links for certain articles that you read, and then all of a sudden you get more of those things. Michelle and I have been looking for a new car, and of course, I'm searching for cars online. I have so many car ads and so much car content now in my feed. It's like, oh my gosh. Now, again, I know how this works, but that keeps reinforcing some of the thoughts that we already have, reaffirming some of our biases. And if we take it out of the realm of even being on our phones or being online, it's like we tend to, in life, gravitate towards people who think the way that we think, who like the things that we like. Now, at work, we can't always choose that, and it can be uncomfortable that we have to interact with people who think differently than us, but it's super important, right? And a lot of times when I'm working with a team, particularly a senior leadership team, an executive leadership team, one of the biggest challenges, but also the greatest opportunities, is when you get a group of people sitting around a table where you have a CEO and, a CTO and a CFO and a CHRO and the, head of sales and head of marketing and on all the way around the table. It's like, wow, we've got some very different perspectives in this room or on this Zoom, because these people have very different roles and functions, and they have very different skills and capabilities, which can be challenging, but also exciting, because it's going to challenge the group to have to think differently, to have to understand, oh, wait a minute, I'm not thinking about this from a legal perspective. I'm not thinking about this from a technology perspective or a people perspective or a sales perspective or product perspective or whatever the case may be. And if we're going to run an effective business and we're going to be an effective business leader, of course, we're going to have our specific area of domain. I'm a sales and marketing person. I'm a HR person. I'm a technology person. I'm a finance person. I'm a legal person. That's what we do. But as I talk a lot about here, and you've heard me share this many times on the show, our role is what we do. Our job is to help the team win. So being able to understand other people's worlds and other people's perspectives is not only important for the way that we think, but also for our ability to connect with and relate to other people that come at things from a different perspective. Or let's say you're in sales and you're calling on lots of people with, a diverse group of people, different backgrounds, different ages, different races, different genders, different orientations of way they think about the world, different businesses. You've got to be able to adapt and adjust and be able to not only think differently so that you can connect with and provide solutions for those people, but also understand where they're coming from. And as I think about our country right now, and I think about some of my own thoughts and fears and concerns and hopes and dreams as it relates to this election and what comes next, I think a lot about what's going to happen, but I also think about what happens afterwards. And yes, it'll be very different depending on who wins, clearly. But I'm of the belief, and here I am with this show called We're All in This Together. And yes, it's about teamwork and it's about leadership and it's about coming together and building strong relationships in our working lives and even at home. But it's also about the communities and the world in which we live. And how can we be in it together if we're constantly fighting with each other and we're constantly trying to prove our point, instead of spending some time thinking differently, challenging ourselves to change our perspectives or at least question our perspective so that we can come back to a more authentic way of thinking and relating to the world. So it's tricky, and especially in today's world for a bunch of reasons, it's not the easiest thing to think differently, to change our perspectives, particularly if we've gotten good at certain things or we've lived a little life or we have strong views on how things should be. And in some cases, that becomes, or that is necessary for us to be successful and effective at what we do in the positions that we are in leadership or at home in parenting or whatever the case may be. But being able to think differently, to change our minds, to shift into a different perspective, to at least understand a variety of perspectives, even if we may not adopt them as our own, is an incredible skill for us to have and to operate with if we're going to be effective at influencing people, at navigating through all the different aspects of uncertainty that we all face these days. So I want to talk about 5 specific things that we can do to help shift our perspective, to flex this muscle of thinking differently, if you will, in a way that can really be conducive. The first thing we can do is, if we have the ability to, is travel. Get out of our location and routine. Now, some of us may have the ability to travel a lot because maybe we travel for work and our job requires us to get on lots of airplanes or drive in our cars lots of places. Maybe we're privileged enough to have the ability to travel personally, or maybe both. Maybe you don't, right? Again, I grew up where we never got to travel hardly at all. And fortunately, in my life over the last number of years, I've had lots more experience with traveling, but I find that leaving our physical location where we spend most of our time is something that forces us to think differently. Again, even if we literally just drive a few towns over, but especially if we move across states, if we live here in the US, or we go to other countries where there may be a different language, different culture, different food, different ways of operating. It is uncomfortable. It is vulnerable, of course, but it does challenge us out of our comfort zone and forces us to think about things differently and realize, oh my gosh, there's a whole world out here that doesn't know much about what's going on in my hometown. Again, I mean, living in the United States, which I love, by the way, but I sometimes find kind of funny when I travel internationally because so much of our news media, so much of our focus, so much of our conversation here in the US is about what's going on here in the US. It's not that we're unaware completely of what's happening elsewhere in the world, but I'm often amazed with how aware other people are in other countries about what's happening. Like when I was in Canada, and especially even when I was in Dubai, lots of people were asking me about situations here in the United States, our presidential election as an example. And I was like, wow, I realize I don't know much about what's happening politically in a lot of these places in the world. So again, if we have the ability and the privilege to be able to travel, that is a great thing for us to do to change our perspective. I mean, even in a more simple way, if we want to be more creative, or if we're working on a project that maybe takes some deeper thinking, not being in the office, not sitting at our desk. There's a place up in Napa, a town called Calistoga, where I go up to write. And that's where I've written my last 2 books completely, and about a half of the book I wrote before that. But leaving my physical location, and even my first 2 books, I was able and fortunate enough to go different places to get out of my daily routine, which helped me think differently, which helped me access a deeper level of creativity that then allowed the book to flow probably in a more effective way than if I had just sat at home in the same spot. So moving ourselves around is a great physical manifestation that challenges us to think differently. The second thing we can do is talk to different people, talk to people who have different perspectives than we do. Ask questions, engage with folks that we know think differently than we do. Again, let's say you're at work and, again, you're on the legal team. Talk to someone on the sales team, talk to someone on the technology team or the product team. Talk to people are more senior than you, people more junior than you, people who live in different parts of the country or the world, just to find out what's going on over there, right? I love when I get on a Zoom call and one of the first questions I ask is, where are you from? And people say, oh, I'm from Phoenix, or I'm from Tallahassee, or I'm from wherever, I'm in London, I'm in Dublin. And one of the questions that I like, well, how are things there? I mean, we can ask the basics like, how's the weather, what's happening, but like, how are people relating to X issue in that part of the country or the world? Because then I find out, I don't know. I mean, I don't know exactly how everyone's relating to certain issues right here in the Bay Area where I live, but I'm in enough conversations with people around here. I get a sense of it. I don't live in Texas or, you know, Oregon or Mississippi or Dubai or, Singapore or wherever. So when I get to connect with people from those places, I find it really interesting to ask them things. Talking to people who think differently than us can be tricky, especially right now in a politically charged environment like we have here in the US, but trying to be open to hearing other perspectives from people who might think differently than we do politically can be challenging, absolutely, but really eye-opening to try to understand. Because oftentimes, especially, look, any political, um, presidential election, at least here in the US, or anytime it gets to that intense, I'm on this side, you're on that side, it can be hard to really listen to people who think differently, or going to vote for the other candidate or whatever. But at least to have some sense, some awareness, where are people coming from who think differently than I do? Not to necessarily change my mind, but at least to have some more awareness, some more empathy, some more understanding to, that's interesting. I don't think that way, or I'm not concerned about that same issue, or I'm not motivated by that, but other people clearly are. And I think it's important for us to have some level of understanding of that, if for no other reason, so that we can relate to our fellow humans better. But also, if we are trying to influence people or debate or discuss things, at least we have some sense of where people are coming from. If we dismiss people out of hand, which is often the case, well, that's ridiculous. Well, you're an idiot. Well, you're one of them. And again, we can do that about politics, but we do that inside of organizations and families and other places. Then the conversation shuts off. Our brain shuts off. Our ability to inquire, to potentially change some of how we think or where we're coming from, goes away. And again, I'm not saying we have to give up our deeply held beliefs and values, not at all. But we live in a diverse world. We live in an environment where people think differently, people vote differently, people pray differently, people operate much differently than we do. And if we want to be able to get along with and connect with lots of different types of people, which for just about every job that any of us have is an essential part of it, it's important that we talk to and engage with people who think differently than we do. And we can do it passively, just it happens to us, or we can do it more proactively. A third thing we can do related to this, and this can be really challenging, especially these days, is consume media and information from people that we know think differently than we do. Again, most of us have a certain amount of confirmation bias that exists on our phone, in our feed. Even you listening to me right now, to some degree. I mean, I'm not talking about things that are too divisive or political per se, but you have some proclivity to resonating with me and my message and my approach, which is why I'm assuming you're either watching this video or listening to, this podcast, which I appreciate, but also it's like, okay, am I listening to this because it's bringing me value, because it's challenging me to think differently, because it's giving me new ideas, or is it simply just reaffirming my bias? Now we think about the consumption of news and information. We're often going to sources that we trust, but usually, and especially in this day and age, have some kind of bias that aligns with our bias. Now, I do this myself. However, there is value sometimes in listening to different perspectives, in clicking on links of things that maybe I'm not going to agree with, that, of listening to people argue and debate issues, so that we can have some sense of challenging our own assumptions, challenging our own opinions, our own beliefs, right? Again, think about topics like artificial intelligence, something I'm fascinated by, but don't know a ton about at this point. But there seems to be kind of two camps when we talk about AI for the most part. It's a complex issue. There's a lot we still don't know. It's evolving quite a bit, but there's the camp of people who are really excited about AI and all the possibilities that it already has brought to us and will continue to bring to us. And there's the camp of people that are terrified of it. It's going to take away jobs and it's going to disrupt the world in this way. We have to be careful. And yeah, there's probably a lot of truth in both of the excitement and the fear related to artificial intelligence. But are we paying attention to it at all? Even if it seems a little confusing and overwhelming and we can't fully understand how it relates to what we do. But then are we listening to people who are both excited and scared about it, so we're getting different perspectives so that it can inform how we think about it? Can we read publications or watch news channels or go to certain sites or places where we know from what we understand about that, oh, those folks there don't necessarily align with my bias, but is there value in me checking that out so that I can like talking to people who think differently than us, so that I can challenge some of my own assumptions and maybe think differently, maybe change some of my ideas and perspectives. But even if I don't change them, at least understand where people are coming from, right? Again, dismissing people as, well, that's ridiculous, or they're idiots, or why would they think that way, doesn't usually serve us and definitely doesn't serve our relationships. So related to this, the fourth thing that we can do is really challenge our assumptions. Now, again, talking to people who think differently than we do, traveling, consuming media and information from different sources, all three of those things can help challenge our assumptions. The world is the way the world is based on my worldview and my bias. And then I travel, and then I talk to people who think differently than I do. And then I watch a news channel that I normally don't watch. And all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, maybe all of my assumptions aren't true with a capital T. They're just simply my opinions, my perspectives, which again, we are entitled to. There's nothing wrong with your opinion. However, we can always have our opinion be more well informed, be more well rounded. Listening to people that think differently than we do, challenging some of the assumptions that we make about how life is, about how leadership is, about how teamwork is, about how parenting is, about how marriage is, about how health is, about whatever. There's things in your life right now, you and I both, we do certain things today that 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, depending on our age, we did the exact opposite. We thought that those things were good and healthy and positive and productive and really worked for us. And now we've changed our opinion. Maybe we've gotten older. Maybe we've had some life experience. Maybe we've learned some things, right? What's the great quote from Maya Angelou that I love? When you know better, you do better. But part of that comes from challenging our assumptions, right? There's a lot of cliches are cliches because they're true, but like the definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. When that happens in life, and by the way, we all do that to some degree, it's usually from a lack of challenging our assumptions. Wait a minute, maybe this isn't working anymore. Maybe I need to try something differently. And look, I'm someone who tends to be a creature of habit. I like to do the same thing the same way, especially if it's working. Why would I, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, another cliche. But there are times in life when we really need to challenge our assumptions, even and especially when things are going well, right? Good is often the enemy of great. Geez, I'm speaking in cliches today, but you know what I mean? It's like when things are going well, are we willing to challenge some of the assumptions? Are we willing to disrupt it? Not just for the sake of it, but realizing we got to continue to evolve. And then the fifth thing that I'll suggest that we can do to really challenge ourselves to think differently and shift our perspective is be curious. Be curious, right? One of my favorite scenes from Ted Lasso, maybe you're a Ted Lasso fan, maybe not. One of his lines, be curious, not judgmental. Because when we're curious, we're we're inquiring, we're inquisitive. Tell me more. I never thought of that. What does that mean? We're sort of digging down into the dirt, if you will, to see what we can find. When we're judgmental, we say, oh no, that's ridiculous. Or, oh, I'm not looking at that. I'm not thinking about that. I'm not questioning that. I already know. Done. Now, look, in life, there are times we have to just assess situations and make judgments, and right? That's how we move through the world. I get it. But can we be more curious? Can we, again, challenge our assumptions with curiosity? Can we try to connect with people who are different than us, who think different than us, who have vastly different perspectives than we do? And instead of judging it out of hand as wrong or weird or bad, just be curious. Tell me more. I had a therapist years ago that used to often say that when I would have a negative thought or I would go into that sort of, being mean to myself, instead of reacting to it, because then it would be sort of a double whammy. I would notice, oh, I'm being mean to myself. And then I'd be mean to myself about being mean to myself, right? She would say, can you just say, isn't that interesting? Right? The fearful thought came up. Oh no, everyone's going to hate me, or I'm a loser, or I can't believe I screwed that up, or what if this happened? Isn't that interesting? When we notice the negative thought, could we just be curious about it instead of judgmental about it? That's bad. That's wrong. That's right. I wonder why I did that. I wonder why that thought, not to necessarily figure it out, but curiosity is often the antidote to self righteousness, to judgmentalness, to that harsh negativity towards others, but even towards ourselves. So, those five things: travel, number one, if we have the ability to do that, that can change our perspective, have us think differently. Talk to people who think differently than we do. Be interested in hearing other people's perspectives that might challenge our own. Like the third thing, consume media or information that we know comes from a different perspective than maybe we naturally come from, right? Fourthly, challenge our assumptions, which those three things will kind of force us to do, but just challenge our assumptions in general. And then fifthly, be curious. There's so many things to be curious about right now, all the time. I mean, look, the fact that you're listening to or watching this shows that you have a certain level of curiosity, of an interest in challenging your own assumptions of thinking differently, that's a wonderful thing. But the more that we can practice that, the more we can create sort of forcing functions for that, the better it'll be for us in terms of our ability to grow and evolve and shift and change, as well as to influence and impact other people. And as we navigate a world that continues to change in a pretty significant way around us. So, thanks for watching or listening. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to hit the subscribe button for the YouTube channel. If you're listening to the podcast, we also love it when you hit the follow or the subscribe button so you don't miss any episodes. I'll be doing episodes weekly, most likely, unless I take a planned or unplanned break from the show, as I did the last couple of weeks. But in the show notes or in the comments below on YouTube or on the podcast, there's lots of links where you can connect with me on social media and learn more about my work. Best place to do that is at our website, which is mike-robbins.com. Until next time, keep bringing your whole self to work and to life. And remember, we're all in this thing together.